Hi, Wanju. Hello and welcome. My name is Shamit Saggar. I am the director of the University of Western Australia's Public Policy Institute, and I'm also Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at this university. You're very welcome to join us here shortly after 5:30 in the evening, Western Australian time, for a webinar that is dealing with an Asian century retrospective and examining the future of Asian-oriented public policy for Australia. You're welcome from wherever you join us, whether it's in different parts of Australia. Some of our panelists are on the East Coast, but of course right across the Indian Ocean and right across Southeast, South and North Asia. The Public Policy Institute that I head up here at the University of Western Australia is an important innovation established in late 2019, in common with a number of research-intensive universities right across the world. This university put its mind to how best it could make sure that the fruits of its research right across different academic disciplines could make their way into the hands of decision makers, whether they're in government, business, non-profits, campaign groups, and so on and so forth. And we are, in that sense, going back to a mission that was first established when UWA was established almost over 100 years ago. And it was created through statute here in the state to serve the interests and promote the interests and the betterment of the people of the state. So in other words, you'll see the work of our institute chiming in many other research intensive universities in Australia and beyond. This evening, we have taken the liberty of going back in order to go forwards. Many of the people who have tuned in this evening will be aware of the fact that a decade ago, in fact, at the tail end of October 2012, the then Gillard government published a very important white paper, the so-called Asian Century White Paper. And many things have happened between now and then, from then and now, sorry. And we are in part here to come and bring some experts together to discuss the significance of that moment, the significance of the report, what it was about, what it wasn't about, and in a sense, where it leaves us today. But in order to go back even further, at a personal note, I recall back in 1992, first visiting Australia. I think it was ANU where I was spending a kind of research term. This is 30 years ago. And it was abundantly clear to me then, as a young man, a young scholar, that here was a country that was clearly in Asia, but not remotely of Asia. It had much to do in terms of familiarizing itself to its region, however that region might be thought of. But most certainly it wasn't or ought not to be a decidedly kind of European country, regardless of the settlement and migration patterns that we'd seen in the last 100 or 200 years. So we're going to go back to this white paper. Can I just sort of point out that one thing that we're going to try not to do too much is to treat it as a witness seminar type of exercise. Our job isn't actually to sit here and sort of pull up the drains and interrogate everyone who was in and outside the room when the report was conceived of, published and received. That's important. We will go back to a bit of that, and one of our panelists was intimately involved in that report and he'll have something to say about that. But what we want to do is try to build upon that point of inflection in modern Australian history, political history, public policy history, both domestically as well as internationally, and ask retrospectively through that examination what it means for Australia now. What are the kind of lessons that you can take away from that? And if you go back to that report, time prevents us dealing with this in great detail. In other words, with this report, I happen to have a sort of a printout copy in front of me. It had, at that stage, a kind of narrative of considerable amount of optimism on regional economic dynamics that was said to exist increasingly, importantly, right across Asia to the north, accompanied by a kind of confident liberal internationalism. It could have been renamed the Look North Report to Australian public policy makers. The white paper contained 5 substantive chapters to do with the productive economy, very much to do with how reform of the supply side in Australia in particular might need to be undertaken to be better able to take advantage of opportunities in and across Asia. It had a building capabilities part, focusing on things like language and cultural literacy, not unimportant. A trade and investment section really talking about the importance of being present in a number of Asian markets where Australian trade and investment commissioners were thin on the ground, if they were there at all. And then, of course, regional security came up, and the importance of the continuing presence then and now, of course, of the United States in and across Asia. And then finally, a part dealing with relationships, very much to do with diplomacy and people-to-people connections, and how it was important to carry on investing in that. So these are some of the things that came up. Listeners or participants will be aware that it's been an on-off exercise in terms of the extent to which the Asian century has been a continuous theme that's run through the work of governments in the last 10 years. Indeed, in the Tony Abbott period as Prime Minister, it went from being ditched to being sort of resurrected in one short period of time. It came back in a sort of different incarnation. And in many ways, we want to sort of get a sense of, if we were starting from here, where might we take the Asian Century White Paper in 2022? Anyhow, enough from me. I'm not actually an expert, though I have a great interest in this field. What we have done for the benefit of participants is to put together a very distinguished panel indeed. And if I can now quickly introduce them, we have to begin with Emeritus Professor Peter Drysdale. Peter is Emeritus Professor of Economics and head of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research and the East Asian Forum. And I think this is one of their sort of publications that I regularly get and read, and based at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. He's widely recognized as being a leading intellectual architect of APEC. But more specifically, he was appointed as a member of the high-level advisory panel for the white paper, the Asian Century White Paper. So we're going to talk to him a little bit about what that was all about and his reflections back on that. Secondly, we have, and we're very lucky to have, Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar. She's a research professor at the Indonesian National Research and Innovation Agency, and she was the deputy chairman of the Social Science and Humanities part of an organization known as the Indonesian Institute for Sciences from 2001 to 2010. Significantly, she was Deputy Secretary for Political Affairs between 2010 and 15, and from 2015 to 2017, she served as Deputy for the Government Policy Support of the then Vice President of the Republic of Indonesia. She's met on a number of distinguished boards to this day, and she serves on the International Advisory Board of the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at ANU. But even more important than all of that, of course, she serves with great distinction on the advisory board of the Public Policy Institute that I head up here at UWA. Thirdly, we have Professor Helen Sullivan. Helen will be known to many scholars in political science and public policy in Australia. Between 2016 and 2021, she was the director of the ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy. And in July 2001, Helen became the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific at ANU. We particularly went out of our way to pick Helen to contribute to this because, as some of you may know or may not know, she was the co-editor of a quite interesting book published a few years ago with colleagues of hers, and it was entitled The Public Policy in the Asian Century, Concepts, Cases and Futures, which tried to get into some of the aspects of how public policy may be a different thing, a different venture when we think about being part of and participating in the Asian century. And finally, we have the Honourable Peter Tinley, MLA, from here in Western Australia, where he serves as a Member of Parliament. Peter is a good friend of the Institute, and he was a minister in the first McGowan Labour government, which won office in 2017. He initially held the portfolio of housing, veterans and youth, and from late 2019 till the state election in March 2021, he in fact was the Minister for Asian Engagement. We particularly picked Peter to participate on that because, amongst other things, he was on the front line, and this was part and parcel of his job description on a day-to-day basis. And he has many sort of stories, possibly including war stories, about what it is to be the minister to engage at state level with a place called Asia. But he'll speak for that. And before, of course, entering politics, Peter had a career in the mining industry, but also he was a member, I think, of the Special Air Services Regiment at the start of his career. So we're going to get going now. I think introductions are complete. And the first thing I want to do as part of this to sort of get the discussion going is to turn to Peter Drysdale, Peter D, and ask him and point out that when the white paper back in 2012 was clearly influenced by the observation that Asia's rise was taking place at a tremendous speed and a tremendous scale, and that undoubtedly Asia as a whole would play a pretty significant part in the global economy. Therefore, Australia could not afford to ignore those trend lines. So with that all in mind, the question I want to put to Peter is, did the white paper, speaking retrospectively, focus on the right region at the right time?
Well, Shamit, I think pretty obviously it did. What was going on in Asia then, and I guess it's still going on in Asia, was very, very big. Of course, it's a particular relevance to Australia, what was going on in Asia then. Already our trade and connections, with economic connections with Asia, were growing strongly. But the pace and scale of the change in Asia economically was clearly going to have a major impact on the Australian economy and offered the potential for even more benefit from the interaction between Australia and the Asian economy. I mean, the scale of the change was going to lead to Asia becoming a very significant component in the international economy. This was a time after the global financial crisis when Asia was introduced to global summitry through the establishment of the G20 process. That was, simply a consequence of the impossibility of dealing with global problems any longer without the active participation with the major powers in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Indonesia, and India, as a part of the G20 process. It changed the whole structure of global governance, what was going on in Asia then. And what was to come still was likely to have an even more profound change. And I think we can see over the last decade or so, in many ways that has. In some ways that weren't anticipated and weren't altogether favourable in terms of the geopolitical divide that's emerged across the Pacific. But nonetheless, the premise of the Asian Century White Paper and the focus on the countries that it focused on in the world was a tremendous and prescient significance to Australia. And clearly it was the right focus. However difficult some of the elements of the interaction between Australia and Asia become in the decade, not the whole decade, but maybe the last half decade in particular.
Okay. And so taking the economic agenda further, I think you yourself have previously stressed that the white paper wasn't just about the economic policy dimension, but also to do with Australia's social policy settings. In other words, Australia would need to enhance and uplift its kind of cultural literacy and its people-to-people connections with and across Asia. So just on that, I mean, how do you feel about that now? How successful has that dimension of what was aimed at in the white paper been?
Well, that's a difficult story. Certainly the white paper was about that, very much about that, about lifting capabilities within national government, in national policy making, but also across the country at all levels of government. And more significantly, I think, in the community at large, the ambition, the understanding was that there was no way in the world that Australia was going to cope effectively with the changes and the kind of interaction that we'd have to have with the major Asian powers, indeed all of Asia, in the future, unless there was a significant change in, dare I say it, culture in Australia and the organisation of things, institutional capacities in Australia. And that had to be an all-of-country, not an all-of-government or whole-of-government or whole-of-governance approach. It had to be an all-of-country approach. And the whole process of writing the white paper involved a lot of community interaction, hundreds of meetings across the country with all levels in the community, talking about the implications of what was going on in Asia for Australia's future. So that was a significant ambition. I mean, this was the first time, I think, in Australian history that a group of advisors like myself, Catherine Livingston and the others were brought into a subcommittee of cabinet to provide advice on the development of the white paper. I don't think that's ever happened before in Australian history, in the history of the Australian federal system. And that was seen to be important because it was seen to be important to take the messages and discussion in the development of the white paper out to the broader community. And we did this relentlessly, travelling across the country, talking to groups at all levels, especially at states. I was involved, I think, in two subsequent exercises at the state level. We had a Tasmanian Asian Century white paper. I was involved in that. Here in the ACT, we had a similar exercise as one in New South Wales, and in South Australia, Western Australia had its own exercise, and we were deeply involved in discussions in the Northern Territory. So it wasn't just a Canberra-centred thing. It was supposed to involve the whole of community. Now, I think we should all talk about this a little bit more later on. Peter T will have some particular observations to make about this, I'm sure. But you asked, how successful that all was. And I've got to say that, I've been in this business of engagement with Asia for 60 more years now. And we had ambitions for the country then that were, I think, the right ambitions, and they're still the right ambitions. But I fear that in many respects, in terms of the investment in the development of our national capabilities in schools and universities and so on, we've slipped backwards since 2012. We haven't progressed, we've slipped backwards. And I've recently undertaken a small study of that, getting a metrics on that, and the numbers are clear. In pretty well across the board, we've slipped backwards. The uptake of Asian language studies in schools, especially Indonesian, I'm afraid, in universities has slipped backwards. The provision of courses in universities and schools, this is on average. Some institutions have held up and their programs have expanded, but overall, the record is not a good record. And we need to inquire why that was so. It certainly wasn't because the promise was not there. It certainly wasn't because the need is still not there, because however difficult some of these big relationships are, with China in particular, now, there's no question that we still need the capabilities that we said we would need then. And even in the federal public service, I would casually observe, but I think in a fairly informed way, the capacities have slipped backwards. They haven't gone forward at all. So the Asian Century is an ongoing enterprise, in my view. The Asian Century white paper exercise. It's one that we still have to confront today, what our national capacities, capacities and will is to engage in the way that we need to engage to manage the relationships that we have to manage in Asia today to do that successfully.
Okay, so I think we'll come back to that without a doubt. It's clear your sense that we've fallen short of where we should have been, if in fact perhaps gone back. I'm sure panelists have something to say about that. Let's just park that for a second. I've got to move on and bring some other panelists in. I want to turn to Professor Dewi now. So Dewi, you served in Indonesia's Deputy Secretary of Political Affairs to the Vice President several years ago, and so you frankly had a pretty close-up side seat looking at the Indo-Australian relationship. I think you sometimes commented it's had a slow, faster crash. And so with that in mind, can you just give us a sense of the perspective on Australia from, I'm going to say the Asian region, but let's just say a part of the Asian region. Asia is a very big place, of course, yeah? So from Jakarta, I mean, how is Australia perceived? How would you characterize this relationship in the last, I don't know, 20 years, should we say?
I don't think we have the whole day. This is a subject for at least a 2-day seminars. You know, I mean, we have, you know, the relations between Indonesia and Australia. I look at it. You know, it's been described as volatile. It's like a roller coaster. You know, sometimes you laugh and sometimes you cry. You know, I've been in government in and out through very close working relations with us. And in fact, you know, when the relations seem to be too close, that's when you start to get nervous because something happens after that. You know, so you cannot take the bilateral relations for granted. I would say that since the transition to democracy, relations have been easier because unlike in the New Order period, you know, the very different political cultures between Canberra and Jakarta have been one of the major stumbling blocks. East Timor has been a major stumbling block. I think that's another story because I was also in the government. You know, during the East Timor crisis, I sat in the meeting with when Prime Minister Howard and President Habibie, you know, talk about that. And I sat through the worst period in our relations. You know, when Indonesia unilaterally revoked the agreement on maintaining security in 1999. I think that's another story. But coming back, you know, to this period, frankly, despite the campaign that Peter D carried out to socialize the white paper, you know, on Asian century, it was not really very much debated in the region. Because I was not, you know, I was not really very much aware of this. I only started to look at it again when, you know, we are doing this retrospective. So it may be because Gillard's government was not that long in power, maybe, you know, and then there's a change of government after that and so on. So there's not much discussion about it. But for Indonesia, Australia, relations with Canberra is one of the most important. And we consider to be, you know, the Indonesia and Australia are very good friends after a very, very difficult period. There's been, during that time, the high-level visits between top leaders became much more frequent, you know, very different from the New Order period. There's Indonesia's President SBY, for example, visited, I think, at least twice. Yeah, and now President Joko Widodo has visited 4 times already. But coming back to 2012, that was the ambition for Australia to become much more engaged with Asia. And I remember in 2013, I accompanied Vice President Widodo first to visit University of Western Australia, where he was given a Dr. Honoris Causa. Then he and Prime Minister Tony Abbott launched that new Colombo plan. And I think that was part of the Australian desire to increase the knowledge about Asia. And then, you know, there's huge ambitions to improve bilateral ties on all spectrums, particularly, you know, with a focus on economic and trade relations, because this is a bit lagging behind. And so that was really at a very high level. But 1 week after Vice President Widodo returned to Jakarta, we read about the revelations about the spy scandals, you know, of all the Snowden's revelations of the fact that the President Widodo's and the First Ladies and Vice President Widodo's phones and several ministers and advisors have been tapped. And within a very short time, relations started to sour again. So this is always the case, you know, in the relations between the two countries. But on the other hand, you know, there's a strong commitment to build very strong relations. As you know, Indonesia and Australia, Indonesia is a non-aligned country. It doesn't sign security alliances with other countries. Australia is the only country with which Indonesia has signed a bilateral security cooperation. First in 1995, between President Suharto and Keating's government, which Indonesia revoked unilaterally in 1999 in the aftermath of the East Timor ballot. And then, you know, 2006 Lombok Treaty, which again, you know, widened the cooperation, the security cooperation between the two countries. And recently, 2020, Indonesia has signed the with Australia with the CEPA, the Comprehensive Economic Agreement Partnership. But there are still a lot of things that need to be given high attention. Indonesia and Australian trade remains quite pathetic, actually. Given the close relations between the two countries. Australia ranks about 13th or 14th as a trade partner. Australia is not a major investor in Indonesia. Many of the smaller ASEAN countries have larger trade figures with Indonesia than with Australia. But at the same time, Indonesia and Australia continues to be good bilateral partners as well as regional partners within the multilateral framework. The ASEAN-driven multilateral framework. Indonesia looks to Australia as a very important partner for the region. For example, when Indonesia promoted the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, and tried to interest the dialogue partners, Australia was one of the first countries that threw its support for Indonesia. When we deal with issues of people smuggling, for example, Australia and Indonesia are co-chairs of the Bali process. So there are many activities, that the two countries work very closely together. But maybe because we are so close, because the relations are so intensive, there are just so many stumbling blocks. The issues of people's migrants, when the Abbott government started to push the boats, really irritated Indonesia. When Indonesia executed, the drug smugglers, from Australia, that soured relations. Australia recalled its ambassador home. That was in 2015. So it's not just Indonesia recalling ambassadors. So when Papuans sought asylums in Australia, and that was what, 2006, just after President Yudhoyono made a state visit to Australia, high-level visits, and then after that, again, Jakarta got very angry with Australia and recalled its ambassador again. So there are just so many points where there are converging interests. The big pictures, we are all on the same page, but there are so many issues because of our proximity that sometimes derail relations.
So let me just probe this a bit. I think it's fascinating. So, cast your mind back to the late 90s. I was in Canberra at ANU, and the discussion was essentially, what's the odds of success of democratization in Indonesia? That was a kind of the high-level debate going on in Australian foreign policy, and the prospects were mixed. Most experts on any given day were not going out of their way to predict the prospects were very, very high. You could get different sort of odds from different groups of experts, and yet I think the track record has been a remarkably stable democracy considering all the predictions of the late 1990s. So many things have gone well. Both countries have got themselves intertwined with each other, their institutions and relationships. And yet the economic thing hasn't really taken off, as you say. So same question again. Is there an orientation to look south economically in terms of Indonesia's development?
Well, I have to be frank with you, whether it's on strategic issues, whether it's economic issues, the tendency is to look north, because that's where all the major players, Indonesia is mostly focused in its immediate Southeast Asian region. And when we are worried about something, the worries come from the north, not from the south. So in the past, frankly, not much is written about Australia in Indonesian papers. In Australia, it's never part of domestic discourse in Indonesia unless something goes wrong. So sometimes, Australia only gets into the mindset of Indonesians when there are irritants. When there is some problems happening, then it will be noticed. But when things go well, people do not really pay that much attention. Now, when it comes to the economy, this is not really my area. That's more Peter's. We are both producers of commodities. Sometimes we compete. But at the same time, Australia is a major source for beef for Indonesia, also wheat. The relations with Australia, has been quite intense as well. In fact, I would argue that there was a desire, for even when other parts of Australia's got disengaged, Western Australia, which looks more towards Asia, tended to be much more oriented toward Asia. But there have been, I don't know why, but Australia could have leveraged its proximity to Indonesia, to really penetrate the Indonesian market, to be a big player in investment and so on. Why it hasn't done so, I don't know. Maybe one of the reasons is because it doesn't have this, the knowledge. If it knows more about the language, the culture, and so on, and more willing, to engage, maybe it will find it that much easier. But I don't know why, European countries will continue to be bigger player. The UK is still a much bigger player, in the Indonesian economy than Australia. I think our Australian counterparts need to answer that.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. We're about to come back to it. It's to do with how countries, I guess, read each other and the raw materials of that, that reading exercise. Let's move on. Okay. Let's bring in Helen now. So Helen, I mean, you were involved in this book called Public Policy in the Asian Century, and I was explaining earlier on how you were a natural sort of draw for us in terms of involvement in this webinar. And in the book, you and your co-authors ask, and I quote, "Why have Western models of public policy and administration dominated scholarship and practice, even when non-Western countries have much lengthier bureaucratic histories? Is it possible, therefore, to define an Asian approach to public policy and administration?" These are questions you're putting and things you're pointing out. So I guess my first question would be, is there kind of mileage in that? Is there a kind of grand discourse of the Asian century and the challenges that it presents to consider other models of non-Western public policy? Just talk us through, where your line of thinking was and all that.
Yeah, and thank you very much for involving me in the webinar. It's I was going back and rereading the book again today, and so much has changed, so much has stayed the same. The impetus. I've been in Australia for a year when the white paper came out, and it really struck me as something that was incredibly interesting and potentially quite important, but also to me it seemed that there was this gap. There was absolutely a very clear economic focus, as you'd understand, and and also on something that's become increasingly important now, of course, the security focus. But aside from some of the references that Peter's already made to questions of capability, there didn't really seem to be much at all about, well, what does it actually mean to do public policy and public administration in any number of countries in Asia. And at the time, I'd been invited to set up a new school of government in Melbourne, and so it just seemed to me that this was an incredibly sensible thing to start thinking about, and to have a conference on what might this mean, not just in terms of the content of public policy, which absolutely is central, but also in terms of thinking about how do we. Is it important to consider that there might be alternative ways of making and conceiving of public policy and public administration? And that took us into a conversation which we didn't start. There are a number of people, many of whom have contributed to the book, who were already exploring this question of, does the sort of Western dominated model of public administration actually hide and get in the way of some useful, creative, innovative things happening? So people like Wolfgang Drechsler, who's still working in this area, contributed a chapter to the book. And he was one of the first people to try and develop, if you like, a set of ideal types of, if you put something that you might call Western public administration as an ideal type over here, then, would there be something called Confucianism? Would there be something called Islamic public administration? And so he started to try and delve into this. And of course, he wasn't the only one. There's a wonderful woman, Jill Tao, who does similar work in the context, particularly of both China but also Korea, and a number of other people who work in different countries, including Indonesia and Thailand, who are all asking the questions of where do our concepts come from? And of course, where we ended up was that there is this entanglement necessarily between what was going on in China many hundreds of years ago, and where Weberian public administration came from. And so, there isn't, it seemed to us, the typical social science response, it didn't seem to us that there was this very clear-cut set of ideal types. Rather, what there was, and indeed still is a sort of an entanglement of an evolution and a set of encounters between different ideas, between different cultures, that can give you some really fantastic insights into both how people see the potential of public policy and public administration, but also where they identify the necessary limits are. And what it seemed to us had been unfortunate was the way in which that complexity, that nuance, had actually just been overtaken, certainly in public administration and indeed political science, by a very Western-dominated perspective, which presumed that there was simply a universal model of how one understood public administration and public policy, and that was something that European and US institutions busily exported to Asia, and where I suppose the zenith or the nadir of this, depending on how you think about it, was the movement of new public management, which completely transformed how public administration was done in many parts of the world. Of course, began in New Zealand, but was part of a tradition of kind of Anglo public administration. And but with the ebbing away of that, I think what the book started to do through the case studies and through the different contributions was to try and get at, well, what else might we be looking for? It's not as simple as saying that there is this, a block of things that you might term Islamic public administration, but there is no question that if you go back historically, culturally, you can begin to see the way in which there are different ideas, different traditions that become enmeshed and entangled. And that is something that, as I say, a bunch of people who contributed to the book have continued to work on. What's been interesting for me, and I think both in terms of the white paper, but also in terms of the book, that conversation in scholarly terms has probably not moved much beyond the niche that it was already in when we curated that edited collection. And so I think there's something there for me about, well, what's going on here, that we're not really, as scholarly communities and public administration, public policies, where you probably have the greatest crossover between policy and academia. Why is it that this remains such a niche area, and by and large the conversation remains mostly about this assumed universal idea of what public administration is? The one exception to that, I think, now is people's attention much more towards how First Nations communities, wherever they are, how those communities and traditions have met with particular types of colonialism, but that's a different strand again. So I think it was a great exercise for us. It stimulated a lot of conversation and a great deal of enthusiasm, and I think some great writing in that collection. But I don't think it's become as much part of the mainstream conversation as we would certainly have liked.
That's fascinating. Can I have a quick follow-up on that? So to go beyond the assumed universalism of what you're describing, one thing I take it as implicit in what you're saying is an ongoing thing. It's not something that's sort of got a beginning, middle, and end. But the curious thing I'm finding is that you're trying to interrogate, you're trying to go beyond that universalism, but from an institution that is essentially a Western institution. ANU, like other universities in this country, is a Western institution to all intents and purposes. Is there a distinction in your mind in terms of going beyond that assumption in other universities or other knowledge centers in Asia with different traditions? Does it make a difference where you are, which institution you're working within?
Of course it does. Of course it does. And you know, one of the things that, you know, is evident in the collection and was, you know, it's very, very hard to try and wrestle with this and certainly in the English language, is that, you know, many people were starting from a position of, well, this is what we've been trained in, therefore everything else is other. And that necessarily, you know, positions the conversation in a particular way, which isn't really terribly helpful because it makes everything exceptional. And we were trying to get away from that. Now, of course, one of the ways, and some of our contributors do this, one of the ways absolutely of thinking about things differently is to consider these questions from the perspective of very different places. And we had a number of those encounters and exchanges, both with scholars in China, with scholars and public policy makers in Thailand, in Indonesia. And again, it was in China, there was certainly the scholars that we met just didn't really think what we were doing was, you know, all that relevant to them. And whereas certainly in Thailand, the conversation was much less about you know, what Australia might be thinking, but much more about how policymakers in Thailand were thinking about their own relationship. And of course, as others have already said, you know, people would be looking north rather than looking south. But the questions, I think there's absolutely a question of where you are, where you're situated, that the language that you are, that is the currency that you work with, you know. And you know, one of the things that we did was to look at, well, how much in the literature is being published about these issues and questions. And of course, because most of the mainstream scholarly literature is published in English, that we were just looking at a tiny fraction of what the conversation might be. So you're absolutely right. You need to be considering these questions in other knowledge centres, in other places, because those places will have both, as we discovered, you know, either not see the questions terribly interesting or relevant, or see it in a very particular way.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. Look,
could I just come in on that, because I think this discussion is really relevant to, you know, how we conduct affairs with our different cultured neighbours in East Asia, in Asia more broadly, and of course the intersection of bureaucratic processes of different traditions comes in the conduct of international affairs, most obviously. International economic affairs or whatever. And I think one of the distinctive contributions of the Asian community to international diplomacy more broadly, international economic diplomacy in particular, is the way in which it's brought a new tradition of decision making to the conduct of these affairs in the region. Regional processes are not like regional processes in Europe or North America. They're very different regional processes. The interactions between bureaucrats in the conduct of policy in these spaces is very different from that in Europe and North America. So this is an inquiry, I think, that's quite important. In fact, we have a couple of PhD students working on this at the ANU right now, this kind of interest at the ANU right now. And of course, Indonesia, its pluralist tradition, it was a case made for democracy in Indonesia because of its pluralist tradition, brings this in spades to the conduct of international affairs and international economic affairs, and the way in which it's informed the construction of our economic cooperation arrangements and other cooperation arrangements in East Asia and Asia more broadly is a very important part of that tradition.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Now, I need to bring in Peter Tinley. Okay, Peter, you've been very patient. And now, just to remind everyone, so in 2017, you were part of a government, WA government here, which had an Asian engagement strategy, and that was your portfolio. And clearly the purpose of all that was to deepen our kind of connections, cultural and otherwise, with Asia, diversify our economic engagement into these Asian markets. So I guess the obvious question would be, you want to just describe to the audience what that is about? What does that feel like? What do you actually, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? Because you're the one who's actually had to go out and do some of this. Most of us just sit around writing books about it.
Thanks, Shamit. Thanks for putting me last, actually, because it's very interesting hearing, and being such erudite company, but hearing basically what was the preamble to what we did here in Western Australia. So the Asian engagement strategy for the West Australian government was written in opposition. Opposition's a dark, lonely place, but it's a great place to reinvent your game. You're not sent there for a rest. You're sent there to come up with new ideas, which forms the agenda of your government, should you win office, which we did in 2017. So I was elected to the Parliament in 2009. I'm 25 years a soldier with the SAS, so very much an internationalist in that sense. And so I brought with me those experiences. I was also a business owner. I started 3 different businesses. And so I could understand the commercial imperative of building markets. And so I will set about writing the Asian engagement strategy on the back of, if in large part, of 2 things. One is the release of the Asian-centric white paper. It gave us a very good lead, and picking up from what Peter D was saying, it actually permeated through the states. We had our own, the Murdoch Commission, which wrote a very good report that broke it down and gave basically a response to the white paper from a Western Australian perspective, which was very helpful for us. And so for those people that might feel in the audience, but certainly the panel, that dry research around public policy and these sorts of things is not valuable. It's immensely valuable because we get the opportunity to operationalise it, if you like, at the subnational level. And that's what we set about to do here in Western Australia. We identified very clearly that Western Australian businesses are not diversifying. We are dominated by the red rock here in Western Australia, and in large part have had not to go out and construct our own diversified economy. Global capital came to Western Australia. We had to clear a pathway for it back in the post-Second World War through the 60s, and then gas followed with the Japanese investment. But by and large, we haven't had to invent our own diversified economy, unlike, say, Victoria, which had its largest economic sector or industry sector is international education. So for Western Australia, the real ambition was to take what we thought was the future of Western Australian jobs for intergenerational transfer of the standard of living that we've enjoyed, and make sure there was a cabinet level representation of that ambition. And that's by and large what we did. Wrote the policy. It went through 20 different committees. It survived, and we got it on the street. It followed on with a diversification strategy, a trade and investment strategy. So as a state, we built a body of public policy, if you like, or that was absolutely focused on where we wanted to take the economy of Western Australia. That hasn't died. It got interrupted by COVID, of course. One of the things that I've discovered in my travels both as a parliamentarian, but also as then a minister for this responsibility, particularly around the trade and investment side of it, is that nation to nation bilateral, multilateral trade arrangements, and this might sound a bit controversial, are very nice. But I remember vividly a Productivity Commission report, and I can't remember the year, that actually weighed them all up and said, well, what net benefit really have they been to the economy of Western Australia, or economy of Australia? And it wasn't pretty, really. And so that troubled me. I want to know why we can do a trade arrangement, which on reading is full of opportunity, and yet we don't seem to be able to generate full value out of it. IHEP is a very good example. I'm chair of the Economics Committee for the Parliament. Right now we're doing an inquiry into our trade relationship with Indonesia as we sit. We've received some very interesting evidence around the difficulties, despite the high level agreements, the difficulties at the enterprise level to actually break in. And this is this regional bureaucracy, this regional approach that Helen was talking about, that they approach these sorts of things quite differently, in spite of what being the headline arrangement. So it's a hell of a ride, but one of the things I do know is that the layers of government are not integrated enough, particularly between the states and the federal system. Nobody at DFAT knew what our ambitions were. Nobody at Austrade really could say, well, the Western Australian ambitions and priorities are this, this, and this is how we're going to support their policy. So it's multifaceted. The final thing I would say to Shamit is that one of the things we've identified is that culture here in Western Australia, and I'm sure this translates across the country, is fundamentally important to understanding that, yes, they're not looking south, they're looking north. We have to move, in our case, Western Australian businesses away from a transactional model of trade and investment. It's not we make you buy, you make we buy, about participation in a global supply chain. And so that allows us the opportunity to create a differential, if you like, of what we actually bring to the fight. With only 2.6 million people sitting out here in the Indian Ocean, what do we bring to an Indonesian partner, for example, that would allow us to work together to operate inside a much broader regional market and market opportunity? So that's a real fight. It's a cultural fight internally. It is a shame. My best advice was that Murdoch Asian Research Centre was second only to ANU. Unfortunately, it's a hollowed out shell of what it used to be. Same with the Curtin School of Economics as well. Used to have a lovely, vibrant Asian economics program, and that also is gutted. So we've got a long way to go to understand that our future lies north. We need to culturally adapt ourselves to it in a very Australian way, and we're going to create a better opportunity for future generations. That's what's driving us.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think people are very sympathetic to the aspiration, the desire. So just go back. I mean, I mentioned in passing some of the war stories. I've heard you mention these on platforms and so on. I mean, and you mentioned culture. So you can have as many dedicated units in universities and beyond that sort of producing this stuff in and beyond the state. Obviously, I'm entirely in favour of that. But you've still got, for instance, day-to-day business culture that has got a very, very specific sense of what it is to make money at state level and actually at national level, given the kind of the billions of dollars we're talking about. How did you cope with that? I mean, how do you begin to engage the mindsets of business leaders to start looking for opportunities in the region, given what the WA economy is already?
One of the things to actually do is make sure we just present them with the opportunities. So a state government is the BD section of the company called Western Australia. We are there to develop business relationships, and obviously through people-to-people connections and the cultural social opportunities that present there. It's not all about the transaction. Examples are, though, is government's got to set and maintain the aim. Governments must identify the priorities, right or wrong, typically mostly right, sometimes a bit wrong. For a subnational government like Western Australia, we have a sister state relationship with East Java, for example. It's vitally important that we travelled into the region and had personal relationships and personal conversations. So going, one of the first visits I did was to reinforce that relationship, that sister state relationship, and see how we can further activate on it. And so I visited the governor, Kafigi, and she was fantastic because she was straight at it and said, when I said, how can we do business? What do we need to do? How can we help? She had three things she wanted straight off, and around education, trade skills and those sorts of things. There's things that a state can actually do. So for me, it was going back with that knowledge, finding the various sectors. There was a naval architectural requirement and so on, and finding those various enterprises and showing them the opportunity and allowing them to get those introductions. It really is quite piece by piece. So my analogy, my sort of saying, I suppose, wherever I picked this up, you can't, with a Western Australian business in particular, I found that you could lead them to water, but you can't make them drink. But what I did was walk them around enough to make sure they were genuinely thirsty. And so when you walk them around and make them thirsty, it's by virtue of what you've introduced them to. They love opportunity. If you present opportunity, then they will respond.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you about that. So I'm going to try to bring in some questions that have been lined up. Just for those of you who are tuned in, please use the Q&A function if you want to jump in, and if you want, also try and direct your question at one or more specific panel members. I'm just going to take a couple that cropped up already, and I'll fire them in a particular direction. So there's the obvious one. Kate McKenzie, who's online, says, why is it still rare for organisations in Australia to advertise for Asian language skills so that graduates with Asian language degrees can find enriching employment opportunities and so on? So it's one we haven't cracked, have we, by a long margin? Who wants to respond to that? The rarity of Australian employers looking for Asian language skills.
Well, let me jump in on that. Start with Shamit. I mean, partly it's a thing that Peter talked about, which is the horizon, you know, and actually, Dewi made the same point in another way from the other side. It's the horizons, the knowledge base to start with. You know, in the boardrooms, I've known boardrooms, significant boardrooms, in which decisions were made by people on the ground that delivered huge benefits to corporates in Australia, on the ground in Northeast Asia, Korea, Japan, China. And the board suddenly realized that there's business going on here and had to discover what it was all about. So, you know, there is a conservatism in corporate Australia of the kind that has to be led and led around the pond a fair few times before it becomes thirsty. That's an issue. That's an issue. A lot of the big developments in trade and other economic relations with Asia in Australia have come through our openness, the participation by foreign investors and partners in the process of developing our resources in Australia, as Peter said in the Western Australian case. So, you know, in this affair and in other affairs, political leadership is terribly important. I've got to say that in Western Australia, you see, you know, this narrative of the Asian engagement has been consistent throughout, even the difficult times. I think you've given it a better shot in Western Australia than in most parts of Australia, especially over the last 5-10 years or so. So where that narrative may have been lost with the change of government after the Asian Century White Paper was delivered, you know, effectively the Asian Century White Paper was electronically burned. If you go to the websites of government that are supposed to feature this thing now, you can't find the Asian Century White Paper because the government that came after the Labor government that delivered it electronically burned the thing. So you have to go to very strange websites, Murdoch University, La Trobe, and so on, to find it now. That's simply a question of political leadership. In the history of the development of Australia's beneficial relationships with Asia, political leadership has been terribly important. In the Hawke-Keating period, it was critical. My wife was involved in writing the first study of Asian capacities in Australia, the Fitzgerald report, so-called, which led to a huge expansion of investment in the development of capabilities in Australia. But that's been lost because we've lost the political leadership that understands the importance of these things. And particularly that's so in the last decade or so since the White Paper was produced. I think there's no question about that. So I think the time has come for rediscovery of the vision. And that's a vision that hasn't changed despite the difficult geopolitical circumstances, especially the huge tensions between the United States and China, in which we are obviously deeply involved. Despite those tensions, the purpose and the objective is still there. This is our backyard. Proximity means a lot in this respect. And that's why the Asian Century's focus on these countries in the region was so important to fulfilling national objectives and national interests.
Okay, so there's another question, and it chimes with something I was going to ask. So I guess the idea is the Asianization of Australia itself. I mean, one thing that's very striking that's happened in this country in the last 20 years, possibly 30, is the expansion of Asian origin populations, or we might say Asianization and Africanization in the same breath. Australia is decidedly, compositionally, a different place to what it was a generation ago, and that's only set to sort of continue and possibly even accelerate. So the question that comes to mind, I'm actually going to use the participants' questionnaire, and she asks, so to what extent does the panel think the increasingly multicultural nature of Australian society can contribute to greater engagement by Australia with Asia? So are the Asian origin populations, descended populations, the diaspora, I guess you'd call them, are they part and parcel of getting this moving, you know, getting some traction? And for that matter, Peter, very quickly, you know, was it part of the equation back 10 years ago? Was that part of what was the thinking going on then? But anyone on the panel that wants to come in on this?
Well, the short answer to your question about whether it was part of the equation back 10 years ago, it most definitely was. The multicultural base, you know, the fact that so many Australians were either overseas born or grew up in families that were overseas born and had language capacities that we couldn't develop in the broader population, for example, was so important to realizing the potential. Still is, of course, still is.
Anyone else in the panel want to comment on that?
Yes, I can.
I will, sorry.
Dewi first, go on.
The multiculturalism is, a double-edged sword in a way. On the one hand, there is this expectation that they can act as a bridge. That you are much more colorful, but at the same time, the reports of attacks against minorities, for example, with this during COVID time, we've read about attacks, racial attacks against people who look Asians. Before that, there were incidents of students coming from South Asia coming under racial attacks. That played out very much also in local papers. So there is still this perception in the region that while Australia is becoming much more multicultural, it is not necessarily seen as becoming much more tolerant. And I think there is something that Australia, there is still an image problem there. If you are asked, when we Indonesia, my institute organized youth leaders exchange between the Australian youth leaders, young leaders, and Indonesian young leaders, and we brought them together. And they say, why can't we get on? And you ask them, what is your perceptions of each other? Shamit asked that. From the Australian side, Indonesia is, despite the fact that Indonesia is becoming democratic, a large population of Australia still thinks that we are authoritarian, militaristic, Islamists, or terrorists, all these nasty things. And from, despite the fact, Indonesia is not an Islamic state. But there is this perception there. But from the Indonesian side, it's white, racist, it's very developed, but still, the image of it being a white society is still very, very strong. And I think that acts as there's still a perceptual problem there.
Thank you for that. Peter T, you wanted to come in?
Oh yeah, just very quickly. One of the great resources we have, particularly at the state level, is those the diasporas of various Asian countries, and they formed different groups, either business or cultural. And one of the was a very good quick story was in Vietnam. We were going to Vietnam, trying to set up some direct flights and do all those sorts of things that we do. And we wanted to make sure we're trying to tap into a new generation of business owners, so younger people. So we went to the Australia-Vietnamese business community, and then found ourselves having great access, if you like, to young Vietnamese business entrepreneurs that we wouldn't otherwise have found. So there is an upside to our Asianization, and it's very much focused on it. So what we did when we got into Ho Chi Minh City was we had a function with these young people, about 40 of them. Just about every one of them was Australian. They were a child of a 75 migrant, refugee, and they have bicultural, if you want to put it in those terms. And they went back to not necessarily their birth country, by the way, to their parents' birth country in this case Vietnam, and they're doing fantastic things. And you talk about a bridge, that was a bridge we've used so many times to such great effect. So there is very much the opportunity to actually engage in an Asianization. We're very careful how I'd say that as a politician, but the Asian influences in Australia.
And as a footnote to that, of course, I mean, there's many other countries rather like Australia who are facing these same sort of challenge and trade-off. You know, Canada, the United States, the UK are all countries that sort of, you know, don't necessarily sing consistently on the question of how they want to use their diaspora population or their settled populations. It's sort of on off. So it's not like, you know, we have to get it right, but it's useful to point out what the upside is as well. That's very good. I want to switch slightly now. I guess question to Helen, but others can jump in. So we have a colleague here. So she's very Krishna Sen, Emeritus Professor at UWA. So she's worried about the notion of an Asian model of public policy. Let me explain to you why she says this. And she says she grew up in an Asian nation and studied and wrote about another one. And contemporary Asia, she points out, the rest of the world are products of 300 years of colonialism. So she wonders whether we can really say that all models of contemporary public administration are not already products of these colonial relations, given the long history of colonialism, rather than being Western or Asian or Islamic or Chinese. You see the point she's trying to get at, that, you know, the region itself has been affected by colonialism on a industrial scale. It's not just that Australia is different from that. It's part and parcel of the same problem being recreated. Just reflections on that, Helen?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And of course, we talk about that in the book, and we have a number of colleagues who write about that. And you see that, you know, if you think about public policy more broadly, you know, including development administration and development economics and foreign affairs, Peter's already alluded to. You know, of course, that's absolutely at the core of how the dynamics, how the institutions have evolved. And absolutely, I would never want to deny that. But what we're trying to say is that recognizing that exists, and I just want to be clear, we aren't suggesting an Asian model at all of public policy. What we were trying to explore was, you know, are there more nuanced ways of understanding why public policy and public administration has evolved the way that it has. Now, of course, colonialism plays a big part in that, but it's not the only part of the story, we would suggest. And what we were trying to examine was, you know, why in different countries, in different places, at different points in time, colonialism would would itself be shaped by existing traditions and histories and cultures. So I absolutely would not disagree with that point at all. And indeed, we talk about that in the book. What we were trying to do was to see if we could get beyond that. I do think, however, that there is something called Western public administration, because it's the thing that, you know, remains dominant in all of the textbooks. And I think it is really important that we challenge this notion that there is somehow this universal idea that has just traveled around the world, because that has, you know, apart from anything else, it just hasn't proved to be terribly effective. So, you know, as people who are interested in making this better, it's important to contest some of those assumptions.
No, can I jump here, Shamit? I mean, I'm very interesting, you know, that I would like to read the book, but I would also be very worried if there is, you know, cultural relativism or Orientalism, you know, somehow excusing the practices of traditional Java, of making a living out of your own offices, you know, and that's the root cause of corruption. You know, in Indonesia, we are really struggling to reform our bureaucracy. And I would not like to say, you know, this is Western source or Islamic source or Hindu source. We don't care. The most important thing is it has to be transparent, it has to be accountable, and you know, it has to be gender neutral. So when it comes to the, you know, the process of doing business, whether it's in government, whether it's the economy, you know, what we want Indonesia to be competitive and to be clean, because that what brought the you know, the new order down is that, you know, that high level of corruption, and this continues to be a major evil in Indonesia. I saw that you know, questions about, you know, well, corruption remains something that is a major deterrent, you know, for investors coming to my country, to Indonesia. So I hope that, you know, that the there's that saying that, the bureaucratic traditions are different, therefore we need to excuse malfeasance. But on the other hand, the understanding about culture, where in Asia, looking at ASEAN, for example, where people, countries in Asia are not terribly legalistic, where process is equally as important. So don't just look at results and outcomes, and very impatient or small talks of getting to know each other. Personal relations are very important. The trust, the personal trust are very important. And that's sometimes why, Western companies find it difficult to get in, because they are not very patient in developing this personal trust.
Yeah. And again, I'd completely agree with that, and that is something we do address head on in the book. And it's also important to say that we were editing the book, so the people who were contributing to the book were people who were experts in what they were talking about. They were experts in Indonesia or Malaysia or wherever it was, and so we were very careful not to be getting into this sort of relativism, but really trying to understand, are there things like transparency and integrity that are consistent across the piece, or are there ways in which some of those things may be perceived differently? So, for example, just picking up on your point about trust and personal relationships, absolutely agree with that. But the point at which that becomes something that is then exclusive rather than inclusive, and can help to foster what might ultimately become corrupt relationships, that is something that, again, is I think an interesting question in public administration. None of these things are are neat and tidy, as you very well know.
Okay, this is a kind of rich discussion. We actually should sort of organise that as a separate debate at some stage. I can see that going on, and it's got lots of, as I said, very rich components. A quick question to you, Dewi. Tim has been very patient with his question 45 minutes ago, frankly, my fault. And he simply makes the point that Indonesia often seems to punch below its weight diplomatically, given its population size, a 250 million people. So he says, if Indonesia got more assertive, will Australia be in a good position to leverage that for its own benefit? Over to you, Dewi.
Tim, don't wish for Indonesia to be more assertive. When I really, Australians used to be very scared of Indonesia under Sukarno, the confrontasi, and so Indonesia has bent backward to tame it, to domesticate, its image. We do not want to frighten our neighbors. It's true that Indonesia has tended to be much more low profile, and particularly within the region. Within ASEAN, Indonesia has carried out a much more low profile foreign policy deliberately. But I would not say that Indonesia really punches below the belt when necessary. Even President Joko Widodo, who is not terribly interested in foreign policy, he's not a foreign policy president if you compare it to President Yudhoyono. Joko Widodo is mostly focused on economic diplomacy, for example. In the past few years, Indonesia has pushed for the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. Indonesia is now, the president carrying out the presidency of G20 under very difficult circumstances. So I would not agree with the assessment that Indonesia is really punching below its weight, but it's true that Indonesia refuses to be assertive. Now, coming to Australia, Australia recognizes Indonesia's strategic positions. After all, Indonesia is the natural leader within ASEAN, and frankly, we can say that it is Indonesia that pushed for Australia to be integrated into the region when there was still debate whether Australia is part of the region or not. Indonesia is the one that insisted that Australia be included in the East Asia Summit. Some other countries at that time only said that the East Asia Summit should comprise only of the 10 ASEAN countries plus the 3 northeastern partners: China, South Korea, Japan. But Indonesia said, no, we want it to be much more inclusive, include Australia and New Zealand and India. So in the strategic and security dimensions, Australia recognizes it. That's lagging behind is in the economy arena. Indonesia suffers huge trade deficits from Australia. It's the country where Indonesia most suffers from trade deficits, and so we hope that the CEPA, will improve the market access and that the terms of trade. for Indonesia. But what we like to see is more of a role for in Australia in developing the smart economy. Indonesia and Australia has just agreed on this partnership on an energy transition. Australia is going to invest, $200 million there, and that's in areas of R&D, education, training, and the higher end economy. There are more that the two countries can do together, and we do look to Australia, to play a much more significant role.
Okay, thank you for that. So look, I mean, time is now going to slip by. I'm going to change gear a bit, and I'm going to ask you all about something in particular, and then I think probably we'll get towards the end. I can't see any more questions lined up. So I think this has been a very fruitful discussion, but it's pretty obvious to anyone. The one thing we've not really tackled head on, it may be entirely my fault, is to point out that, of course, the region, Asia, however you construct it, whether it's viewed from here looking north or from any angle you conceivably, I mean, it's changed a lot. I mean, geostrategic competition means by definition, if you look back to the last 10 years, the world has changed. The world has changed very, very dramatically. And so I was really quite struck by how we, particularly in Australia, looked at how the region may or may not be affected by emerging great power rivalry, if it was ever thought of it in those terms. So here, I'm going to read out a quotation. I'm going to ask each of you to comment on it, respond to it briefly if you can, because time is going to slip away. Peter Jennings, who just stepped down from being the head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, one of our most respected foreign policy think tanks, back in 2012, before the report was out, he offered the following commentary. And I'm just going to read this out, and I'm going to go around asking you to comment on it. He says, and I quote, "A lot of people have observed that Asia's growth means that for the first time, Australia is facing a future in which our largest trading partner is not a partner in a close alliance, friendship, or even a partner of a close ally." He says, "I don't know that matters much, but it is a development worth thinking about." He goes on to say, "It's desperately important that this white paper should develop that thought. After all, it would be dangerous to undervalue the US relationship as much as it would be to overstate the potential of a closer cooperation with China." These are very prescient words, if you think about it, expressed 10 years ago. How do you reflect on what he was pointing out, nothing more than that, 10 years ago, and how it sort of affected us in the last 10 years? I'm going to start with Peter Drysdale on that, briefly, because time is running out.
It was at the base of thinking about these issues then, and it's reflected in some of the discussion around the economic stuff in the Asian Century White Paper. And the thought then was to strengthen regional arrangements to provide a better, broad, comprehensive security framework, not a military security framework, comprehensive security framework within which the relationships with countries that weren't natural allies were going to be fostered and managed, and that's become even more important since. So I think this is a challenge for the future, how to steer this course. I think we have a government in Australia now grappling with this issue big time, and not yet settled on a way, except a way that certainly accentuates the increased importance of Southeast Asia, Indonesia in particular, in managing these issues. And a starting point in thinking about that is to be very clear in understanding what the nature of the region is. It's not a set of bilateral relationships between China and the United States, China and Australia, Japan and Australia, and Indonesia and Japan, and so on. It's a highly interdependent and complex set of economic relationships which involves all the parties in the development of interdependence through global value chains and regional value chains, which are incredibly important to sustaining economic prosperity and, for that matter, economic and political security in the region. So it's managing that is the challenge. And I think we have to be inventive about how to define frameworks which provide ballast to the challenge of big power rivalry across the Pacific in order to manage that. And I should say that the Indonesia relationship in particular, and the way in which Indonesia relates to its ASEAN partners and its partners in the broader region through the East Asian Summit process, is going to be critical to an effective approach to these problems.
Thank you. Okay. Dewi, on that reflection on the quotation from 10 years ago, just a couple of minutes, if you could briefly react to that. And you're muted, by the way. Could you? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's the perceptions, during that rather innocent time, the Canberra's perceptions of the region as being more benign, and the stress on complex interdependence and the stress on the economy. Now, recently, the perception is, we seem to Australia seems to particularly live in parallel universe. There's the economic universe where Australia is part of the RCEP, with China as a main player there. Mm-hmm. But then there's this realist perspective where the stress is more on the alliance with the US and the new multilateralism, with a Quad. But of course, the Quad has a very strong Asian dimension, not just Japan, but India is part of that. But AUKUS, now this interestingly, the perspectives from a lot of countries, in Indonesia has been very critical of AUKUS, particularly some nuclear submarine components. But there is a restrengthening of this Anglican identity. A lot of people in Jakarta say, how do you see it? This is a return to motherland. The Canberra, Washington, and London getting together again. So it's less of Asia, less of Australia being part of ASEAN-driven multilateralism, but it's more, the smaller, the AUKUS hard balancing towards China, and I think this is the perception now. The hard balancing against China gains more prominence than the economic integration with the wider Asia.
Okay, thank you for that. Helen.
I completely agree with Dewi, and I think what I would add to that, particularly in the context of the AUKUS conversation, is the reaction from the Pacific to that announcement. That there was extraordinary concern from islands in the Pacific when that announcement was made, and so that I think has really fractured important relationships, and particularly as we don't really know what AUKUS is actually ever going to amount to yet. The only other thing I would want to say very quickly is I think the thing that concerns me most about the discourse in Australia now is, for the last 10 years, we've had this balancing of the economic and the national security, if you like, and with this idea that it's all mediated by interdependence and globalization. Mm-hmm. I'm very, very concerned that now almost everything is becoming securitized, that we are seeing everything through the lens of security. And I think that is, that plays into a particular idea of what's going on with the geospatial politics and the rivalries, but I also think it's incredibly worrying, and talk of some kind of national interest strategy that has comprises everything, but really is constructed and framed through a security lens, I think is incredibly worrying.
But just to extend the point for a second. But the security concerns that exist today that are clearly more pronounced than they were 10 years ago.
Yes,
yeah,
but
that's not my point, though. My point is that we're not, this is not just about national security. The point is, over the last 10 years, everything, has been reviewed through the lens of security: food security, energy security, human security. We see everything through that lens in a way that, of the preceding 30 years, everything had been seen through an economics lens. So that's my concern. I'm not an expert in, and I wouldn't get into the conversation about, more or less questions about national security. My concern is the way in which that conversation, that discourse, has bled into all aspects of public policy. And I think that's really worrying.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, just to add to Helen's point, which I think is a really important point to emphasize. I mean, if you pull the plug on the economic interdependence that I described a moment ago in East Asia, in all of Asia, our involvement in it, that would be an incredibly damaging thing to social welfare, political stability, and economic welfare in Asia. The decoupling process that's underway and is motivated by the things that Helen describes, not only in the United States and between the United States and China, but the way in which, as Helen says, we're increasingly thinking about national interests here would be very damaging to us economically and also damaging to the region economically and politically. Yeah.
Okay. Peter Tinley, you get the last word.
Oh, thank you. Look, I just simply want to quickly add that a lot of this speaks to that cul-de-sac that we're finding ourselves going into, where we see this monolithic thing called Asia, which is just so unhelpful when it comes to these sorts of conversations. And what it doesn't give regard to is the dynamic nature of change inside each of these countries. And Dewi talked about the nature of democratization in Indonesia and what impact that's had on their community and how they see themselves in the region. So some very deliberate steps. In Australia, once again, it underscores the simplistic approach we seem to have across a community. And as a politician, one of the things you really try to do is build consensus for change. That's ultimately what you're trying to do. And as long as we see ourselves as tethered to an old world view, whether that's true in fact or not, the more we're going to get away from the opportunity of middle powers and all powers within Asia, the Asian region, to give us a hand to actually cut a path that really is an Asian future. And it might sound really tangential, but making sure we include First Nation Australians as part of our culture, as part of our international expression, and becoming a republic is so important, in my view, to creating a narrative that's an Asian orientated narrative, one that actually chimes into the region, not one that's grating against it.
Well put. Okay, yeah, very well put. Okay, look, that was that came out just fine. I think we've landed us on the deck just with a couple of minutes to go. It just leaves it for me to first of all thank our panelists, Peter and Peter, Dewi and Helen. It's been a real pleasure to invite you and engage you in this discussion. It's been really fruitful, certainly from our end. Hopefully our audience feels the same way. We no doubt will pick up on some or more of these points at some stage in our program in 2023. We are, as we speak in the Institute, just kicking around or trying to formalize a plan to have a PPI, Public Policy Institute report on Australia's relationship with the Indian Ocean region, and sort of picking up some of these points and also thinking a little bit about what it takes to engage with more than just a country or a small number of countries, but right across the Indian Ocean. Essentially, what do Indian Ocean countries, including Australia, have in common? So please look out for that. That will happen in the first half of 2023. And it just leaves it for me to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for being engaging as an audience, and thank you, panelists, for being very succinct and really very informative and perceptive in how you've approached this. Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you and good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.